Hello everybody and welcome to this Sustainalytics webinar on our recently released report entitled Utilities, the Great Transformation Begins. My name is Niamh O'Sullivan. I am a member of Sustainalytics thematic research team and I have the pleasure of being your moderator for today's webinar. We are delighted that so many of you could join us for the webinar, and I would like to extend a special note of welcome to those of you that are joining us for the first time. If you are unfamiliar with Sustainalytics and what we do, we are a responsible investment research firm providing detailed ratings and analysis on company environmental, social and governance, otherwise known as ES&G, performance, so that institutional investors can take this into consideration in their investment decision-making processes. One of the many things that Sustainalytics does is to produce periodic reports on the broad sectors and industries that compile our research universe, such as the utility sector. These reports identify key ESG issues that we believe are material to the sectors in question. They showcase best practice, rate company performance against these ESG issues, and highlight leaders and laggards in the field. And in general, they provide information that we believe are valuable to institutional investors in their portfolio construction, development, management, and engagement processes. I am joined in our Amsterdam office today by my colleague Reginald Kawazumi, who is our resident expert on the utilities sector. And we are also joined in the Toronto office by my colleague Mr. Doug Morrow, who is Associate Director of Sustainalytics Thematic Research Team. Doug and Reginald have co-authored the utilities report, and in a moment they will present the main structure, key findings and takeaways of the report to you. This presentation will take approximately 40 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A session of approximately 15 minutes. So we will aim to finish at 5 p.m. Central European time. Finally, this webinar has been recorded and will be sent to you, the participants, over the coming days. We look forward to any questions that you have following the webinar, should we not be able to deal with a lot of your questions today. So without further ado, I will pass over to my colleague Doug, who will begin the presentation.
Thanks very much, Niamh. My name is Doug Morrow, and I'm the Associate Director of Thematic Research here at Sustainalytics, and I'm very pleased to be here today to be able to talk to you about our Global Utilities Report. In terms of a brief outline for our presentation today, I'll begin by offering just a few words of background on the thematic research team, and then we'll jump right into an overview of the utilities sector. This will provide some important context for the discussion and analysis that follows. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague Reginald, who will walk you through our findings for the three key ESG issues that really form the thrust of our report. These are sustainable products, community relations, and emissions, effluents, and waste. We'll then conclude by summing up the major points, and then we'll be quite happy to take your questions in the Q&A. So the thematic research team at Sustainalytics is responsible for producing our portfolio of sector reports, and the reason why we produce these reports is because they contribute in a pretty major way to our team's overall objective, which is promoting Sustainalytics thought leadership in the field of responsible investment. One of the major features of the report is an explicit focus on understanding how companies are positioned within given industries on the key ESG issues for their respective industry and sector. And if we think about where the responsible investment field is trending, it's evident to me that there's going to be increased emphasis in the future being placed on precisely this sort of analysis. So we're very clearly moving away from a one-size-fits-all model to understanding sector-specific metrics. And in this way, our reports are in line with where the industry is trending. And you can see here some sample reports that we produced recently, including the cover page of our recently released utilities report. So let's take a brief look at the composition of the utilities sector universe. So in our study, we looked at 234 companies around the world. The vast majority of these companies were publicly traded, although a small number were also non-listed. These were primarily government-owned utilities. From a geographic standpoint, 3/4 of the universe, or just shy of 3/4, are based in developed markets with a concentration in the U.S., and to a slightly lesser extent in Canada and Japan. And then just over 1/4 are based in emerging markets with a concentration in Brazil and China. And if you look at the composition of the universe from a GICS sub-industry standpoint, it's quite clear it's extremely well diversified. So we're covering everything from electric utilities, which is the generators, all the way to gas utilities, water utilities, and even renewable pure plays. So the sector as a whole is really quite well diversified. So I think a really interesting starting point to begin our presentation today is to look at the recent historical financial performance of the utilities sector. And as you can see here on the graphs, it's quite clear that the sector is struggling. It's faced major headwinds in both Europe and the U.S. As proxied by the S&P Europe 350 Utilities Index, you can see here in Europe that the sector has delivered a total return of just over 1% since 2008, and that compares to 47% for the overall market. In the U.S., utilities have fared better for several reasons, but even there, they're still underperforming the broader market. And the argument that we would make, and that we'll make today in our presentation, is that certainly at a high level of understanding, that the main reason why the sector is struggling is because the sector finds itself in a period of profound change. Now, we refer to this change in our literature and in our report as the Great Transformation. And as you'll hear from Reginald, what's interesting about this phenomenon is that it's actually very multidimensional. So it's not just being driven by what I think we can all agree are pretty obvious factors. So this would be, of course, the explosion in renewables capacity, the growth of distributed generation, and things like that. It's also being driven by fairly dramatic changes in consumer expectations for what they want from their local utility and utility services in general. We're also seeing some pretty interesting things around product innovation. And I think even structurally, certainly at the margin, we're seeing changes in terms of how utilities see themselves fitting into the architecture of the modern economy. So the industry, to summarize, the industry really sits in a period of profound change right now, and many utilities are struggling to adapt to the implications of this trend. And again, another point I'd flag here is that the overlap between ESG issues and shareholder value is really quite strong in the utility sector. So many of the issues that would be top of mind from an ESG audience, including many of the issues I just mentioned, including renewables capacity and the growing energy efficiency of modern economies, things like that. These are really hitting the balance sheet and the income statement of utilities companies pretty profoundly. So to sum up, from a business standpoint, we really see the sector sitting right now in a virtually an unprecedented shift in its fundamental business model. And we see successful utilities moving away from a strict commodity provider mindset, which has essentially been the dominant mindset since the foundation of this industry, to a much more nuanced and collaborative model. What does this mean for investors? Well, I think it means a few things. Historically, the sector has been viewed as a defensive industry, and it's been prized by the investment community really for two things. One is a high dividend yield, and two is high stability, low volatility. What we see coming down the pipeline is really an increase in volatility for a whole bunch of reasons. And one of the offshoots of this is that it's going to be an increasingly attractive playing field for alpha-seeking investors, because it's going to give them more opportunity to pick winners as the volatility plays out in the sector. So I think that provides a nice snapshot from a high level of some of our sort of overarching findings. What I'd like to do now is pass off to my colleague Reginald, who's going to walk you through some of our more detailed analysis on the 3 key ESG issues that we see playing out in this sector.
Thank you, Doug. Here, my name is Reginald Michel, Research Products Analyst on the utility sector. I am here to present you the main essence and findings of the utility sector report. We were motivated to write this report to find out what sort of undercurrents lie beneath the change introduced briefly by Doug, what sort of new industry mindset is emerging because of this, where it is heading to, finally what the investment community needs to be aware of. And we find ESG analysis can provide a powerful tool to understand this sector evolution. The utility sector is one of the high impact sectors, and we have quite a number of key ESG issues as exemplified in the materiality matrix on the slide. 3 of which we consider of high importance. Those are shown in the upper right corner of the matrix, and they are emissions, effluents, community relations, and product sustainability. This matrix, by the way, showcases how much each ESG issue is impacting the business and sustainability, and at the same time how they are impacted by business and sustainability in return. For instance, if we take product sustainability, we find its impact is quite high on the ESG domain, while it is rather moderately impacted by sustainability issues. Therefore, we consider utilities' conduct in this domain to be quite important. Next slide. One of the most visible evolutions in the utility sector in the recent decade is exponential growth of renewable energy overall. We just cannot emphasize this importance too much. The graph is an example from solar power, photovoltaic energy, power generation by solar panels. And that has been a popular choice by a number of companies in the sector. We clearly see the pace got faster after 2009. And there's more to it. If you look at 2011, the share of the green domain, which represents Europe, has been rather decreasing in the overall pie in favor of other world regions. That means other world regions such as the United States and China, as well as Japan, they're really picking up this technology for serious deployment. Of course, these are world's 3 largest economies, so the global trend is quite unblemished there. Now, let's step back to get a broader picture. Besides the renewables, utilities have shown a multitude of sustainable service offers. For instance, many pioneering companies are distinguishing themselves in other non-generation businesses for main income source. For example, energy management, environmental consulting, involvement in smart grid, or much larger scale smart city urban planning has become a significant business interest of the utility sector. Next slide. Another interesting observation is the falling cost of low carbon technologies. This is the levelized unit cost of power generation per energy source. The main message here is that quite a number of renewable energy technologies have already reached cost competitiveness. If you take a look at the mid-range, we find quite a number of renewables show cost competitiveness as against familiar thermal power such as gas or coal. Globally, the generation from all types of renewable energy has doubled since 2010. Besides the technological sophistication and efficiency gains, the enlarging economies of scale by rapid deployment of this capacity is really helping the commercialization of these new technologies. In total, investment volume there is running at $200 billion per year, and to put that into perspective, that's about 40% of new power capacity added. So can we conclude that renewables are cost competitive enough in their own right already? Well, the cost of operation is of course determined by a number of factors. For example, subsidies. We find subsidies are quite widely available also for fossil fuels, and they can mar the cost competitiveness of other low carbon offers in favor of cheaper fuel, which is important in a number of countries, including both developing and developed countries. So the progression of the renewable offer will not be linear, but overall the trend will remain upward. Can you go to the next slide? Here we would like to show you some of the example companies which we consider leading, and also a group of companies that we consider struggling in this domain. Enel Green Power, the third one from the row, from Italy, is one of the few renewable energy pure plays which is directly investable in separation from its mother company, Enel SPA of Italy. This is helpful towards the investor who are looking to realize low carbon asset contents from the utility holding. Other leaders such as EDP from Portugal, it positions energy management for its industrial customers as a main business. We also have another example from Japan. Electric Power Development Corporation exports an ultra-efficient generation technology that can pull traditional coal power almost to the efficiency level of the average gas-fired plant, and plans to export this technology to developing countries with rich coal sources. So we think overall this is the positive activity in terms of generating larger impact. On the other hand, fossil fuel pure plays tend to populate the bottom group. For example, Dynegy from the United States, its power generation capacity is nearly entirely coming from the fossil fuel sources, although in more recent years, gas capacity has been added, and this may be able to change the carbon and pollutant portfolio of this company in the future. Adani Group of India is another example of a struggling company. Adani Conglomerates is one of the biggest industrial groups of India, and it's a big trader of coal. It also a heavy use of lignite. That is a type of coal known to be rich in sulfur as well as water properties. Lignite is quite widely available with attractive commodity prices, but it comes with even more severe environmental consequences than other common fossil fuel sources. Next slide. Now let us move on to the next ESG issue, that is the community relations. To set the stage, it is probably a good idea to mention that global utility demand and supply in 2008 had seen a historic moment when non-OECD countries collectively surpassed the demand of aggregate OECD counterparts. So what is happening meanwhile in developed countries? Their demand has been mostly stable, or in some cases stagnated, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Although what is clear from this trend is that utilities are made to be really aware need to question where and how they locate their facilities for production and get the right logistics done to ship the value to the customers. And that's how community relations come into play, because utility industries typically come with capital assets, for instance, power plants or pipelines that stretch for thousands of miles. These can be installed in ecologically sensitive regions or areas of outstanding natural beauty, or simply near populated areas. And they accompany an influx of outside labor to construct such facilities, large machineries, roads to introduce such things to the regions, and much more. The natural response to all these is, don't come to my backyard. And this is an NIMBY attitude, which is very common by host communities. Utilities in general are structured in quite ironically in utilitarian ways, in our opinion, meaning benefits, the industry seeks to benefit the maximum number of people at the lowest social cost. So everybody wants to be on the beneficiary side rather than being becoming those who have to bear the burden. Interestingly, this type of response doesn't favor low carbon or so-called clean tech solutions. Supposedly green projects, for example, wind farms, can be socially rejected as well. And we observe the same tendencies in both developed and emerging market countries. Communities may be also worried about the real estate devaluation due to the presence of utility facilities in the vicinity. According to a study in the United States, up to 7% of the real estate value can be compromised by having large utility capital assets in the neighborhood. Next slide. So we have seen that impacts are quite big, but curiously policies are slow to emerge. On the graph, we found only 8% in our research universe appear to have strong programs, while staggering 36% of utility companies have nothing at all. Social risk can be quite costly when conflicts emerge. We have a couple of examples of such real case costs. GDF Suez of France, it has several large hydroelectric dam development projects in Brazil. Because of the community rejection and resistance movements everywhere in Brazil, the company had to go through full-scale environmental impact assessment 3 times over and had to change the location of the dam after the commencement of the construction. In another case, National Grid from the United Kingdom, its wind park development, as against the company's initial expectation, it was rejected by the Welsh residents and had to go for a more costly offshore solution. We also have cases coming from sanctioned countries which can add human rights dimensions. For instance, in Myanmar, we have seen cases of Ratchaburi electricity from Thailand and NHPC from India in the construction projects of dams. And these dams are located in armed conflict area where the violence and human rights abuses are frequently reported and well documented by military forces by the Myanmar government. Therefore, we consider a project in such areas of long-lasting impact. We consider companies are complicit in such abuses that take place in the area. Next slide, please. In a similar tone, such companies tend to struggle with ESG performance. let us start from the laggard group. Major controversies are often long-term due to the characteristics of the utility industry. They lock the companies in the very non-constructive situations for a very long time. And laggards often have weak to no engagement programs. Those are very typical characteristics we find everywhere in the world. On the other hand, leaders exhibit robust programs, and also they excel in additional areas, for instance, in good governance in relation to community management, or projects that impact, that positively impact the host communities. We have examples from Centrica from the United Kingdom. It has excellent access to service programs to address UK's fuel poverty issue. In a similar manner, Gas Natural of Spain, it has brilliant human rights policies and practices for its renewable energy development projects in Latin America. Next slide. Yeah, we have now come to the third key issue, emissions, effluents, and waste. The impact by the utility sector is probably the most quantified in a clear manner when it comes to emissions and effluents. For instance, the utility sector is responsible for more than 30% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions in 2011, and this figure is much higher than any other single industry. So utility involvement in the discussion of, for instance, climate change is very serious in nature. Emissions are also not limited to greenhouse gases. We also have a number of pollutants. We hear cases of, for example, air pollutions in many Chinese cities in modern times. These are primarily caused by the emissions of the utility sector in China. On the third issue, quite importantly, this sector is also a heavy issue holder in the water scarcity consideration as well. I'd like to spend the next moment on this issue. Currently, most power generation, because of its historic reliance in thermal power generation, it is very much water reliant. You need water to heat, cool, clean, maintain the facilities, pretty much anything you need to do to generate value in the utilities industry. In this context, there are some variances on the graph. You notice coal and nuclear power have higher water intensity at about 15 US gallons per kilowatt hour of generation, which is much higher than gas-fired generation. This adds to the fact that we need a lot of power to run the economy and everything we do. In the case of the United States, the US power industry needs about 36 billion gallons of water per day just to run its basic operation. Altogether, core-related value chain, including the part done by the utilities industry, it accounts for about half of all industrial water used across the globe. So how does it look like if we see this from water perspective instead of the power generation perspective? Well, besides the climate change, we also have significant interest for sanitary, clean and available water. And if you wish to improve the river water quality, this would inevitably increase the energy demand for wastewater treatment, while also reducing the water available for abstraction, for cooling, and other industrial use that utility industry requires. Therefore, water and power are mutually interrelated, and we expect that there will be inevitable conflicting needs for limited water in many parts of the world. Next slide, please. The issue of emission is also a most regulated one, more than other two ESG issues of services and community-related issues. Regulations often prohibit certain things, but they can also be smartly designed to foster good ESG behavior in companies. We took one example of such regulatory design. This is the roadmap for flexible and intervention schemes. The green area represents emissions trading scheme, and blue represents carbon taxes. Amongst all, probably the most widely acknowledged one is the European Union emissions trading, which is followed closely by other regional schemes in developed countries, such as in Canada or in Japan with its regional level emissions trading schemes at the moment. And this is also interesting to see that similar schemes or ideas are spreading to emerging market countries. For instance, Brazil and Chile, they already have functioning trading floors. As well, in 2015, this year, China is set to open its first emissions trading program, which by its estimated volume to be the largest of such kind in the world. This means companies in the utility sector must anticipate the future cap and trade schemes or taxation in the long-range planning. In case of developed market utilities, they price between 50 to 5 euros per ton of carbon dioxide in the portfolio analysis. However, sometimes this scenario construction can go wrong. A recent case from Europe, they show the failed scenario analysis has pushed the modern contemporary gas plants that are very efficient end up losing money by operating more. Therefore, those became stranded assets and had to retire such rather efficient facilities in favor of carbon-heavy, less efficient aging facilities. So imperfect market does not always favor the less polluting. Therefore, the companies in the utility sector really need to develop a robust scenario construction capability by taking into account the emerging emissions tradings or other market-based mechanism. Next slide. We have a number of indicators on this issue of emissions and effluents to assess the company's performance in this domain. In comparison to other sectors, utilities are actually doing quite well in terms of preparedness. So the bar is set high. They often come with some kind of carbon-related targets or programs. So in order to be ranked as leaders in this ESG issue, they need to do something additional. What makes a company a leader? Our finding is that advanced and contextualized emissions management is the key to additional success. And such companies tend to have group-wide commitment to reduce carbon emissions with clear time boundaries that are supplemented by segment-specific targets or per business unit. But altogether, this makes the commitment to their environmental targets more in the right context of the business they're in, and gives the granularity so that plans and the necessary resource allocations are more realistic. Struggling companies, on the other hand, they typically lack environmental management systems in order to define the responsibility lines, accountability, as well as quantitative capturing of their impact and future planning. Next slide, please. In conclusion, the three key ESG issues are keys because they all have respective counterparts from the fundamentals that sustainable products are coupled with things related to distributed generation, networks, and service-oriented industrial model. The second one, community relations, are driven by the state of infrastructure, what is physically possible by this sector at the moment, and emissions, effluents, they are related to the fluctuating demand. Globally, we find it is the first issue that's the most pertinent because this is what is driving the great transformation. So altogether, utilities have become more networked and complex, at the same time more active. Next slide. To conclude, the great transformation shifts the paradigm of business and investment practices. For business, its relevance is really the challenge to its fundamental business model. We have seen the undercurrents are the shift of vertical provision of commodities to a more service-oriented networked activity and value generation. And this is a drastic change. It pushes utilities to become more collaborative, responsive, and customer-centric business model. And that is where the sector is struggling to define at the moment. Therefore, more premium should be placed on advanced ESG practices because they serve as a proxy to the future success of utilities according to the new business model that is emerging. So we predict the winners will be defined increasingly by its ability to innovate new customer-focused products and services. For the investment community, the main message is the volatility and more competitive markets. There are many more new entrants from other industrial sectors entering the utility businesses because they find utility quite attractive to start. So attention should be given more on the alpha for companies' ability to innovate. At the same time, this gives asset owners more opportunities to find a growing set of potential engagement opportunities, asking companies what their plans are vis-a-vis the emerging industrial rule of the game. So investors should watch out on issues such as carbon bubble, inclusion to bottom of the pyramid, stranded assets, or efficiency opportunities. Next slide. So this has been the essence and the main findings of what is the undercurrent and the emerging mindset of the utility sector. Back to you, Niamh.
Great. Thank you very much, Reginald, and thank you, Doug, also for a very insightful presentation. If I could just begin the Q&A with you, Doug. I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you mean by alpha investors being more attracted to utilities now during this great transformation and over the long term. And if you could begin that by maybe clarifying for those listeners that are not familiar with the terminology, what you mean by alpha investors, please.
Sure. So with alpha investors, we're just referring to investors whose objective is to beat a financial benchmark on a risk-adjusted basis. And these are distinguished from beta investors who are really looking for more low volatility strategies. Now, and of course, the vast majority of managers, asset managers in the world subscribe to the alpha generation or actively managed thesis. So essentially what we see going on is that the utilities industry is going to become increasingly appealing to a much larger chunk of the global asset management community because of the volatility that we see coming down the pipeline. And to reiterate, I mean, it's clear if you look at the sector already, we're already seeing signs of this trend. So if you look at the German market, which is perhaps where, you know, the growth in renewables capacity is gone the quickest in recent years, we're already seeing a spike in volatility. So this phenomenon is already occurring. If you look at the explosion in solar PV, I mean, as Reginald clearly outlined in his talk, it's just incredible to see how this energy source in the last 10 years has gone from virtually nothing, insignificant, to generating 1 to 3% of global electricity demand. So we think this is going to have disruptive effects. And if you look also to echo Reginald's point about new entrants, I was reading just last week that Google, among others, is intensely planning to enter the utilities business with beyond-the-meter applications to help homeowners generate their own electricity and improve efficiency. So all these trends are really, there's a confluence of drivers coming down the pipeline that we think is going to push up volatility. And just to summarize, we think that's really going to make the sector more attractive for alpha-seeking investors because it will give them more opportunity to pick winners.
Okay, great. So very interesting times ahead, it seems. Maybe if I could move to Reginald for the moment, just to clarify for listeners as well, there's a whole range of different utility companies that you focus on in the report. Could you clarify for listeners whether you distinguish between power generating utilities as opposed to those that just transmit the power afterwards? Do they make up a balanced amount of utility companies in the report?
In the utility sector, all of such subsections are considered utility companies. So they're all covered in the report. The answer to your question really depends on the regulatory framework of the region or country of operations. In some cases, those are strictly separated. In some cases, you're allowed to conduct some merchant activities across subsections. So what is necessary is that in general, utility regulation is being deregulated in order to introduce more competition. But we have seen from past example that competition didn't necessarily turn into efficiency gain due to the failure of collaboration. So deregulated utility companies actually need to be aware of what the other subsections of utility companies are doing and generate businesses, because as we have talked in the presentation, they're all connected. So excellent utility companies, they also need to develop capacity to collaborate better in a more increasingly multi-stakeholder environment.
Okay, great, great. And this great transformation that is affecting this whole range of utility companies now, how well placed do you feel that these companies are to move to this service-oriented business model that you have been talking about today in the presentation and also in the report? And maybe again, just to clarify for listeners what we mean by service-oriented, and then which range of these companies that you've just spoken about are best placed to be able to address that?
Yeah, this is a very important question as it touches the core of a message by the report. The idea behind the service orientation is that, unlike in the past, in the future, who produces the energy or water commodity will become less important. What will become more important is how that value is delivered to the customers, in what way. So we have also ESG interests come to the interplay, community, environment, etc. So the generation can be done by non-utilities. Doug has introduced Google, non-utility, might be coming into a major utility player in the future. Or households, non-corporates, might put up a solar panel on the rooftop and become a prosumer, a consumer and producer at the same time. And utilities' job will become how to contain all these generative value in a meaningful way for everybody. So it will become more networked. Utilities will also need to be able to show distinguished value to the customer for long-term relation building.
Okay, that's great. That's very interesting, because if you consider one of the key ESG issues that you focus on in the report, it's stakeholder engagement. And in this move towards a more service-oriented, customer-centric business model, do you think that's going to have knock-on effects on broad stakeholder engagement policies and programs of these utility companies? Because we see in the report at the moment that they're performing quite dismally when it comes to these actual activities. There only seems to be 8% of the companies that we covered, the 234 companies, that have a strong stakeholder engagement policy. Do you think that this transformation, as I said, is going to affect this in any positive way?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Investors in the utility industry should ask those questions, because the great transformation is inevitable. It's already begun. So the train has already departed the station, but we don't really have the clear destination available for all of us. So in this context, how does a utility company see its position in the future? How does it want to participate in the designing of such future? That should be the interest of the shareholders as well.
Okay, so the stakeholders and improving stakeholder engagement should be at the core of the development of
yes,
policies.
It should ask the long-term strategic questions,
yeah,
yes.
Very good. Because as we see, there's so many controversies that have been affecting the utilities services when it comes to stakeholder engagement over the last few years. So it would seem that it's a very obvious activity that they need to address going forward. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, great. I'm just conscious of time, and I'm wondering, Doug, maybe a last question for you. In terms of broader trends that are affecting the industry right now, we see that there's a drop in oil prices. Do you feel that that's going to affect the utility sector in this great transformation that we have been talking about today?
I think the collapse in oil prices is going to hurt the transition to a green economy in some sectors, but I don't think it's going to slow down the great transformation. I think the trends we talked about today move beyond oil. They're not tied to oil if we think about the transition to a service-focused model. But even more importantly, most oil in the world is not burned to generate electricity. It's used to generate transportation fuels, so they don't compete with solar and wind. And as an optimistic way to close out this presentation, we might even say that the growing volatility of fossil fuel prices might even accelerate this transformation, because volatility is very hard for fuel planners, and renewables offer the prospect of a complete certainty when it comes to future fossil fuel costs, which is zero.
Very good. That's great. Final word to Reginald. We've been talking about the great transformation beginning. Do you see an end in sight? Will we know when we reach it?
Yeah, Neem, I don't have the exact year, as this is not driven by certain regulation, but this is driven by sort of a self-awareness of the utility sector itself. I think it would be interesting to see what kind of a utility industry has emerged by the year 2035. That is the benchmark year typically used by a lot of international organizations such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So would be interesting. Yeah,
so watch this space, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah, very good. Okay, thank you very much, Reginald and Doug. We need to wrap up the webinar at the moment, but I would like to thank all participants for listening in. We're very happy to deal with any follow-up questions you may have about the presentation. You can send those through to Doug and Reginald to the email addresses that you see on your screen, and they will be more than happy to deal with those very shortly. Finally, we would like to highlight that this is one of a series of webinars that we will be having on our forthcoming sector reports, so we would be delighted if you would also join us for those and to participate in the Q&A afterwards. Thank you very much for listening today, and we look forward to seeing you back here again shortly.